So for this talk, I'm going to go over Mizar and Alcor. Mizar and Alcor, I like that really sophisticated illustration. That's less. Mizar and Alcor were a binary star, and to find them, the Big Dipper. Here's a Big Dipper. You have Mizar and Alcor right there, and that's actually. If you have 20/20 vision, you can see that it's two separate objects. But that was known to be true since the 1500s. Over time, our telescopes got better and better and better, and we realized that the binary system was actually a 5-star system back in 1908. So what happened in 1908, we expanded it outwards, and we realized that Mizar, that star on the right or left, was actually two sets of binary stars. So one became 4 once they had a telescope that had a much higher resolving power, which is really, really, really cool. So binary, and inside of that star. And then that was back in 1908. Fast forward to 2009, there was another exoplanet search. They were looking at Alcor, and they realized, wow, there's a red dwarf around Alcor, so that's a binary system too. And that was 2009, they found that extra one. So, and then this binary system is in orbit around this quad system. So this is a sextuple system. You have 6 stars all in orbit around each other, which is really cool because, well, back in the day, they didn't know that the orbits were that weird. And that being said, the reason why I wanted to mention Mizar and Alcor is that back in 1998, back when I was 12, 13 years old, this book was written, Looking for Earths. And in it, well, of course, I have the paper here. It's up on Vixra, but I'll link it soon enough. They have, it says here, now all that has changed forever. After laboring quietly for years in mountaintop observatories around the globe, several teams of astronomers have at last trapped unseeable rays that eluded capture for over half a century. As a result of their persistent efforts, we now have convincing evidence that planets really do exist around other stars. They say they have the evidence now, as of the 1990s. But it was never a question of the evidence, it was a question of the interpretation of the evidence. It was the scientist's mind who was taking their beliefs and then placing upon their observations. They weren't actually looking at their observations in their true form. They were taking their educations and placing their educations as being the factual information, and then saying, well, the evidence is this or that. But really, people don't realize it's these astronomers that are interpreting the evidence in their own worldview. And that's the whole point of this theory development, is that I can interpret the evidence differently. And the evidence doesn't change, it's just the interpretation of the evidence changes to make it conform to a more holistic, more understandable, more streamlined, more common sense worldview. And that being said, the idea that they said, oh, well, planets really do exist around other stars. For the people who know this theory, a planet is an old star. They were actually looking for old stars around the young stars. It wasn't planets around stars, it was old stars around young stars, because the old stars no longer shine. They were looking for these objects in orbit around these objects. And with the Alcor Mizar system, they actually already have found planets in orbit around other stars outside of our system. But their definitions of those planets is of their astronomical objects is what was getting in the way, and their assumptions. See, because they had separated star from planet, they didn't realize it's the same thing. So when they look at the Alcor system, they should have realized that these are 2 planets in orbit around each other. These are 2 planets in orbit around each other. These are 2 planets in orbit around each other. And from the very beginning, back in the 1500s, they should have realized when they found this to be a binary system, these are 2 planets. Well, they're not anymore because we've been able to resolve them at a higher at a higher resolving power. We have more powerful telescopes. They didn't realize that these are much more down here, but they could have also realized that these, from their observations, were still a binary system. This was an extra solar system right here. Now, this is an extra solar system, this is an extra solar system, and this is an extra solar system. When you go to Wikipedia and you look up planetary system, and then you look up star system, they have them separated still for some odd reason. They don't realize that planetary system and stellar system or star system, it's the same phenomenon. It's exactly the same thing. It's tomato, tomato. It's potato, potato. It's the same thing. So this book, it was written when I was 12. I'm glad I didn't read it when I was 12. I would have been, lost, just as lost as these people are still to this day, because of their assumptions. And it's very dangerous and to take an assumption, what you believe to be true about the world, and then placing that as being a fact, and then trying to form a worldview around that assumption. Because what happens is when the assumption has its legs kicked out from underneath it, you have all that stuff that was built on top of it all falls down to the ground too. The whole house of cards falls. And that's what's happening right now in astronomy, even though the astronomers are being really, really quiet about it. The entire house of cards is falling because their assumptions have been kicked out from underneath them. And I still have yet to see them admit that it's been kicked out from underneath them, because they all want to save face, but that's exactly what's happening. And for the note, I would actually expect, since this Alcor system has at least a red dwarf around it, and red dwarfs are around 250 million years old, I would expect there to be much more objects orbiting around that red dwarf even. And also around these objects, but more or less around that red dwarf. I would expect there to be some orbiting much older stars around that red dwarf that no longer shine too, which is why they're really hard to find. With all this is going on, I also think it's important to note that how we got into this situation, and it's sort of like it snowballed from the assumptions. And that snowball, basically, I have it written in this paper, but I'll go ahead and talk it out with you guys. What happened back when they were taking spectroscopic surveys and they're figuring out what the stars are made out of, they were splitting the light up. They were figuring out what chemicals were inside of these stars, and then they sort of made an Ouroboros for the evolutionary line of stars. For instance, they never assumed that stars no longer shined. They always assumed that all stars shined, and if it didn't shine, then it wasn't a star. But that's the problem. They should have realized that the old stars no longer shine. But they took that, and then they further differentiated the two concepts, star and planet, and then they started to place ages on them. So the age factor, what happened back in the day, is they assumed the age factor assumption and the orbital assumption. They've always taken the sun to be conceptually different from the Earth, and they've also always taken the sun to have always been the object that the Earth orbits for its entire existence. And Jupiter has always orbited the sun, and Neptune has always orbited the sun. And they forced that to be true via proclamation. The astronomers never had any evidence that the Earth has always been in orbit around the sun. They never had any evidence that Jupiter has always been in orbit around the sun, of Saturn, of Neptune, and Uranus. They never had any evidence of that at all. That's the assumption. And that assumption should have been thrown under the bus when they realized, they did their calculations for how old the sun is. It's a few tens of millions of years old. And then they found out how old the Earth is, a few billions of years old. And they should have said, wait a second, how can something like the Earth, that's billions of years old, have always been in orbit around something that's only millions of years old? They never asked that question. Instead of asking that question and getting rid of that assumption, they went and forced the sun to be billions of years old by inventing the fusion model of stars. And now they have this pseudoscientific fusion model of stars that they're trying to force to be correct, that keeps these objects hot for billions of years. And then they look at planets, and they're all byproducts of the fusion stars having been formed. But they don't realize that the planet is the very, very highly evolved star that actually is billions of years old. And the objects that are very, very young are the ones that shine. So when the astronomers, when they want to look at young star systems, young planetary systems, they have those young planetary systems. That's what these binary star systems are. This is what young planetary systems look like. But now they're going after this disk stuff still, with the nebula hypothesis. Oh, we see a big cloud of dust a disk of dust around a star. It's like, how is that supposed to form a planet? A planet is a gargantuan object that takes something the size of a star to form, because that's what it is. It's the remains of a star. And I see this a lot now when I read these science articles. They say, well, we see this big dusty cloud, and we see the trail that the planet is carving around inside of this. Well, then that means the planet was already there. It's like a lawnmower. It's mowing the grass. It's carving its way through a cloud that wasn't there previously. That cloud that they claim is the place where a planet forms is just the place where a planet was destroyed. What happened is a large object slammed into another object, created a huge shrapnel field. That shrapnel field kept on, let out its angular momentum, because momentum is conserved, and it stayed around that star, making a huge cloud, and the objects that are pre-existing continue to carve a path through it. But it wasn't that cloud is forming a planet. No, that cloud was created from a destructive event, and then that pre-existing planet is carving a path through it. So you see these new planetary systems forming from as claimed by these astronomers. They don't know what they're talking about at all, because they're still assuming that a star is something as old as a planet, not realizing the star is the young planet. The star is up here. It's too hot to have formed life. But I'm going off a tangent here. All right, guys. Mizar and Alcor. Later.